Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle by Pierre Klossowski. Introduction. This is a book that will exhibit an unusual ignorance. How can we speak solely of Nietzsche's thought without taking into account everything that has subsequently been said about it? Will we not thereby run the risk of following paths that have already been traveled more than once, blazing trails that have been marked out many times, imprudently asking questions that have long ago been left behind? And will we not in this way reveal a negligence, a total lack of scruples with regard to the meticulous exegeses that recently have been written in order to interpret as so many signals the flashes of summer lightning that a destiny continues to send our way from the horizon of our century? What then is our aim, if indeed we have one? Let us say that we have written a false study, because we are reading Nietzsche's text directly, because we are listening to him speak. Can we perhaps make him speak to us? Can we ourselves make use of the whisperings, the breathings, the bursts of anger and laughter in what may be the most ingratiating and also the most irritating prose yet written in the German language? For those who can hear it, the word of Nietzsche gains a power that is all the more explosive insofar as contemporary history, current events, and the universe are beginning to answer in a more or less circuitous manner the questions Nietzsche was asking some 80 years ago. Nietzsche was interrogating the near and distant future, a future that has now become our everyday reality. And he predicted that this future would be convulsive, to the point where our own convulsions are caricatures of his thought. We will try to comprehend how and in what sense Nietzsche's interrogation describes what we are now living through. We must not overlook two essential points that have hitherto remained veiled, if not passed over in silence, in the study of his thought. The first is that, as Nietzsche's thought unfolded, it abandoned the strictly speculative realm in order to adopt, if not stimulate, the preliminary elements of a conspiracy. It thereby made our own era the object of a tacit accusation. The indictment had been handed down by the Marxist exegesis, which had at least exposed the intention of the conspiracy, since every individual thought of bourgeois origin necessarily reveals its complicity in a class conspiracy. But there is a Nietzschean conspiracy, which is not that of a class, but that of an isolated individual, like Sade, who uses the means of this class not only against his own class, but also against the existing forms of the human species as a whole. The second point is closely related to the first, because Nietzsche's thought meditated on a lived experience to the point where it became inverted into a systematic premeditation, prey to an interpretative delirium that seemed to diminish the responsibility of the thinker. There is a tendency to grant it, as it were, extenuating circumstances, which is worse than the Marxist indictment. For what do we want to extenuate? The fact that his thought revolved around delirium as its axis. Now, early on, Nietzsche was apprehensive about this propensity in himself, and his every effort was directed toward fighting the irresistible attraction that chaos, or more precisely the chasm, exerted on him, a hiatus which, starting in his childhood, he strove to fill in and cross over through his autobiography. The more he probed the phenomenon of thought and the different behaviors that result from it, and the more he studied the individual reactions provoked by the strictures of the modern world, and always in relation to his conception of the ancient world, the closer he drew to this chasm. Lucid thought, delirium, and the conspiracy form an indissoluble whole in Nietzsche, an indissolubility that would become the criterion for discerning what is of consequence or not. This does not mean that, since it involved delirium, Nietzsche's thought was pathological. Rather, because his thought was lucid to the extreme, it took on the appearance of a delirious interpretation, and also required the entire experimental initiative of the modern world. It is modernity that must now be charged with determining whether this initiative has failed or succeeded. But because the world is itself concerned with Nietzsche's initiative, the more the modern world experiences the threat of its own failures, the more Nietzsche's thought gains in stature. Modern catastrophes are always confused, in the more or less short term, with the good news of a false prophet. What then is the act of thinking? There was a suspicion lurking silently in the writings of Nietzsche's youth, which came to the fore in an increasingly virulent way in the unpublished fragments contemporaneous with human, all too human, and especially the gay science. What is lucid and what is unconscious in our thought and in our actions? A subterranean question that disguised itself outwardly in a critique of culture, and that intentionally made itself explicit in a form that could still be integrated into the speculative and historical discussions of his time. Nietzsche's thought thus followed, in an absolutely simultaneous manner, two divergent movements. The notion of lucidity was valid only to the degree that total obscurity continued to be envisioned and thus affirmed. Quote, At every moment, chaos is still pursuing its work in our mind. Concepts, images, feelings are there juxtaposed fortuitously, thrown together pell-mell. In this way, relations that astonish the mind are created. The mind recalls something similar. It feels a flavor. It retains and elaborates both according to its art and its knowledge. Here is the last small fragment of the world where something new is produced, at least as far as the human eye is concerned. In sum, here again, it is a matter of a new chemical combination, which as yet has no parallel in the becoming of the world." End quote. A thought only rises by falling. It progresses only by regressing, an inconceivable spiral, which to describe as useless is so repugnant to us that we are wary even of admitting that successive generations follow the same movement, even if this means that we associate ourselves with the rise of a mind only as long as it seems to follow in unison with culture the ascent of history. As for the remainder, we leave the descending movement of this spiraling thought to those who specialize in the failures, the dregs, the waste products produced by the function of thinking and living, experts who, in accordance with this convenient division of labor, hardly need to concern themselves with this tension between lucidity and obscurity, except perhaps to know, on the day when each reaches a verdict on the other, that they had picked up the accent of delirium. To want to detect this accent in Nietzsche's thought would from the outset require us to consult the very authorities that his thought called into question. Either Nietzsche was delirious from the outset in even wanting to attack these authorities, or else he was clear-sighted in attacking the very notion of lucidity directly. That is why, at every step, Nietzsche's thought found itself circumscribed. On the inside, by the principle of identity on which language, the code of everyday science, depends, in accordance with the reality principle. On the outside, by competent institutional authorities, the historians of philosophy, but also and above all, by the psychiatrists, the surveyors of the unconscious who, for this very reason, control the more or less variable range of the reality principle to which the person who thinks or acts would bear witness. Finally, on both sides, by science and its experimentations, which sometimes separates and sometimes brings the two together, thus displacing the boundaries and adjusting the demarcations between the inside and the outside. As long as Nietzsche respected these variously delimited spheres from the viewpoint of inquiry, his understanding seemed to comply with two principles. The principle of reality, insofar as he simply described reality historically, he analyzed it in order to reconstruct it, and thus to communicate the result of his research to others, and the principle of identity, insofar as he defined himself as a teacher in relation to what he was teaching. But once the demonstration, required by institutional language for the teaching of reality, was turned into the movement of a declarative mood, and the contagious mood or tonality of the soul supplanted the demonstration, Nietzsche reached the limit of the principles of identity and reality, which were answerable to the very authorities his own discourse was presumably based upon. Nietzsche introduced into teaching what no authority responsible for the transmission of knowledge, philosophy, had ever been advised to teach. But Nietzsche introduced it surreptitiously. His language, on the contrary, having pushed to an extreme severity the application of the laws required for communication. The tonality of the soul, in making itself thought, was pursuing its own inquiry, to the point where the terms of the latter were reconstituted as a muteness. This thought spoke to itself of an obstacle that the intention to teach would stumble over at the outset. The obstacle, whose muteness was experienced as intensity and resistance, put the aim of teaching itself in question. Now, the resistance of the mute obstacle was nothing other than the virtual reaction exerted by the authorities of identity and reality. Muteness on the inside was merely speech on the outside. The assent, a sentiment of thought to this speech on the outside, was merely the ressentiment of the mood of the mute tonality. Nietzsche's declarations transferred the muteness of the mood onto thought, insofar as the mood came up against a resistance of culture from without, that is, the speech of universities, scientists, authorities, political parties, priests, doctors. In identifying himself with this mute obstacle of the mood in order to think it, Professor Nietzsche destroyed not only his own identity, but that of the authorities of speech. As a consequence, he suppressed their presence within his own discourse, and along with their presence, he suppressed the reality principle itself. His declarations were directed to an outside that he had reduced to the silence of his own moods. Though they were reduced to silence in Nietzsche's declarations, however, the speaking agencies had never been anything other than the configuration of his moods. The mute intensity of the soul's tonality could be sustained only as long as a resistance from the outside was still speaking. Culture. Culture, the sum total of knowledge, that is, the intention to teach and learn, is the obverse of the soul's tonality, its intensity, which can be neither taught nor learnt. The more culture accumulates, however, the more it becomes enslaved to itself, and the more its obverse, the mute intensity of the tonality of the soul, grows. The soul's tonality catches the teacher by surprise, and finally breaks with the intention to teach. The servitude of culture thus breaks forth at the moment it collides with the muteness of Nietzsche's discourse. Since Professor Nietzsche's ultima verba turned into aphasia, it is easy for doctors to see this as a confirmation of their own reality principle. Nietzsche went beyond the limits. He lapsed into incoherence. He ceased to speak. He howled or remained silent. No one sees that science itself is aphasic, and that if it admitted it had no foundation, no reality would subsist, from which it derives a power that induces it to calculate. It is this decision that invents reality. It calculates so as not to have to speak, for fear of falling back into nothingness. End of introduction. 1. The combat against culture. Quote 1. Is the philosopher still possible today? Is the extent of what is known too great? Is it not unlikely that he will ever manage to embrace everything within his vision, all the less so the more scrupulous he is? Would it not happen too late, when his best time is past, or at the very least when he is damaged, degraded, degenerated, so that his value judgment no longer means anything? In the opposite case, he will become a dilettante with 1,000 antennae, having lost the great pathos, his respect for himself, the good, subtle conscience. Enough. He no longer either directs or commands. If he wanted to, he would have to become a great actor, a kind of Cagliostro philosopher. 2. What does a philosophical existence mean for us today? Isn't it almost a way of withdrawing? A kind of evasion? And for someone who lives that way, apart and in complete simplicity, is it likely that he has indicated the best path to follow for his own knowledge? Would he not have had to experiment with 100 different ways of living to be authorized to speak of the value of life? In short, we think it is necessary to have lived in a totally anti-philosophical manner according to hitherto received notions, and certainly not as a shy man of virtue, in order to judge the great problems from lived experiences. The man with the greatest experiences, who condenses them into general conclusions, would he not have to be the most powerful man? For a long time, we have confused the wise man with the scientific man, and for an even longer time with the religiously exalted man. End quote. Quote, only now has it dawned on humanity that music is a semiological language of affects, and later we will learn how to recognize clearly the impulsive system of a musician through his music. In truth, he did not intend to betray himself in this manner. Such is the innocence of this type of confession, as opposed to every written work. Yet this innocence also exists in the great philosophers. They are not conscious that they are speaking of themselves. They claim it would be a question of the truth, when at bottom it is only a question of themselves, or rather their most violent impulse is brought to light with all the impudence and innocence of a fundamental impulse. It wants to be sovereign and, if possible, the aim of everything and every event. The philosopher is only a kind of occasion and chance through which the impulse is finally able to speak. There are many more languages than we think, and man betrays himself more often than he desires. How things speak! But there are very few listeners, so that man can only, as it were, chatter on in the void when he pours out his confessions. He squanders his truths, as the sun does its light. Isn't it rather a pity that the void has no ears? There are ways of seeing that make man feel. This alone is true and just, and truly human. Whoever thinks otherwise is making an error. Ways of seeing we term religious and moral. It is clear that what is speaking here is the sovereign impulse which is stronger than man. In each case, the impulse believes it holds the truth and the supreme concept of man. Undoubtedly, there are many men in whom an impulse has not become sovereign. They have no convictions. This, then, is the first characteristic. Every coherent system of a philosopher demonstrates that one impulse directs it, that there is a fixed hierarchy in it. This is what is then called truth, and the felt sensation can be described thus. With the truth, I am at the height of man. The other person is of a lesser kind than myself, at least in terms of knowledge. In rough and naive men, one conviction also predominates in their mores, and even in their tastes. They are the best possible. In cultured people, there reigns a certain tolerance in this respect, but one holds all the more rigorously to one's own criterion of good and evil, according to which one wants to have not only the most refined taste, but also the only legitimate one. This is the commonly reigning form of barbarism, that one doesn't even realize that morality is a matter of taste. For the rest, there is in this domain a maximum of imposture and lying. Moralizing and religious literature is the most full of lies. The dominant impulse, whichever it may be, resorts to ruse and lying to prevail over the other impulses. Alongside religious wars, there is always a moral war going on. That is, one impulse wants to subjugate humanity. And as religions gradually die out, the struggle will become all the more bloody and visible. We are only at the beginning. End quote. What then does the behavior of the philosopher amount to? Is he a mere spectator of events, at once lucid and impotent? Or, if all commentary is useless, will he have to intervene directly? But how can he make a direct intervention? Through analyses, declarations, warnings, or incentives? Does he have to win over people's consciences in order to provoke an event breaking the history of humanity in two? Or rather, does not this event, which the philosopher apprehends, the consequences of the disappearance of a unique god, the guarantor of identities, and the return of multiple gods, first have to be mimed in accordance with the gestural semiotic of the soothsayers and prophets? We must break with the classic rule of morality, which, on the pretext of realizing a human potential, makes humanity dependent upon habits adopted once and for all. Instead, we must behave in accordance with the strict demands that follow from relentless reflection. If a demand of thought can arise in an unforeseeable manner, it is because it can arise from behavior itself, thereby opening up that same behavior to the disparagement of a contradictory attitude. Behavior can never be limited by its regular repetition, nor can it limit thinking itself. A mode of thought that would restrict behavior, or a mode of behavior that would restrict thought, both comply with an extremely useful automatism. They ensure security. In reality, any thought that experiences the uneasiness of this provisional state reveals its own lassitude. By contrast, any thought that allows itself to be called into question, whether by an internal or external event, reveals a certain capacity for starting over. Either it retreats from or it goes beyond the statements made in the interval. It is on the basis of this lassitude or this capacity, this retreating or this going beyond, that Nietzsche will judge previous philosophers. Neither Descartes, nor Spinoza, nor Kant, nor Hegel would have been able to construct their systems if, by some chance, they had renounced a teachable coherence in order to speak of existence from their own lived experience, though Descartes came close to doing so and seems to have concealed this intention. Nietzsche maintains that they have only complied with a secret concern to express the movements of their own moods. Quote, they claim it is a question of the truth, when at bottom it is only a question of themselves. Or rather, their most violent impulse is brought to light with all the impudence and innocence of a fundamental impulse. It makes itself sovereign and, if possible, the aim of every thing and every event. The philosopher is only a kind of occasion and chance through which the impulse is finally able to speak. End quote. What then did Spinoza or Kant do? Nothing but interpret their dominant impulse. But it was only the communicable part of their behavior that could be translated into their constructions. What this means is that Nietzsche rejected, purely and simply, the attitude of the philosopher-teacher. He made fun of himself for not being a philosopher, if by that we mean a thinker who thinks and teaches out of a concern for the human condition. Nietzsche here acted ruthlessly, disruptively, and wound up achieving, one might say, a smashing success. Il casse la baraque. Nietzsche rejected any thought that was integrated into the function of thinking because it is the least efficacious. For what are the thoughts and experiences of a philosopher worth if they serve merely to guarantee the society from which he comes? A society believes itself to be morally justified through its scientists and artists, yet the very fact that they exist, and that their creations exist, is evidence of the disintegrating malaise of the society, and it is by no means clear that they will be the ones to reintegrate the society, at least if they take their activity seriously. Since Nietzsche was thinking and writing in a solidly bourgeois society, some 30 to 40 years before its first fractures appeared, his manner of seeing still seemed to conform to the initiatives undertaken by that same society. It is only today that we are able to measure the impact of his words and of his rejection. bourgeois society no longer exists, but something much more complex has been substituted for it, an industrialist organization which, while maintaining the appearance of the bourgeois edifice, reorganizes and multiplies the social classes in accordance with the increase or decrease of ever more diversified needs, and which, because of its automatism, disturbs the sensitivity of individuals. What Nietzsche meant to say through his own rejection of the system was that if philosophy merely concerns itself with a transmission of problems, it will never get beyond the general interpretation a particular social state gives of its own culture. For Nietzsche, to make an assessment of Western culture always amounts to questioning it in the following manner. What can still be created from the acquisition of our knowledge, our practices, our customs, our habits? To what degree am I the beneficiary or the victim or the dupe of these habits? With regard to his contemporaries, Nietzsche's own manner of living and writing, and of thinking, was the answer to these diverse questions. For Nietzsche, the moral question of knowing what is true or false, just or unjust, could now be posed in the following terms. What is sick or healthy? What is gregarious or singular? Quote, the first shoots of fecundity, insofar as they are a sign of health and promote vigor and resistance, initially have the character of sickness. The first explosion of force and will to self-determination is a sickness that can destroy humanity, and even more sickly are the first strange and wild attempts of the mind to adjust the world to itself, to its own authority. End quote. It seemed to Nietzsche, who was himself subject to valetudinary variations, and constantly feared that his own thought showed the effects of his depressive states, that it would be equally revelatory to examine the forms of thought put forward by previous thinkers from the viewpoint of their relation to life, to the living, that is, from the viewpoint of the rises and falls of intensity in all their various forms, aggressiveness, tolerance, intimidation, anguish, the need for solitude, or on the contrary, the forgetting of oneself, in the midst of the turmoil of an epoch. Nietzsche, therefore, judged morality to be the principal metaphysical virus of thought and science. Quote, I see all philosophers, I see science kneeling before a reality that is the reverse of the struggle for existence as taught by Darwin's school. That is to say, I see on top and surviving everywhere those who compromise life and the value of life. End quote. The mediocre dominate those surplus natures whose overabundance of life is a threat to the security of the species. There are therefore two powers, the leveling power of gregarious thought and the erectile power of particular cases. This allowed Nietzsche to identify those metaphysical systems commanded by moralities whose only aim is to perpetuate the reign of gregarious norms and instincts. Any system that does not receive their approval cannot survive. But there also exist systems that are impracticable to the greatest number and which are consecrated to a particular case. Heraclitus, Spinoza, and others form a code reserved purely for a limited group, La Rochefoucauld. The metaphysics of Kant, by contrast, harbors a behavior that Nietzsche summarized in the image of the fox who returns to his cage after having broken out of it. Quote, to construct systems in the very epoch where we see science beginning is pure childishness. In return, we must make long-term decisions regarding methods for centuries, for one day the direction of the future will have to pass into our hands. Methods, however, that themselves come from our instincts, in regulated habits that already exist. For example, the exclusion of ends. End quote. But in Nietzsche's mind, these methods amounted to a reproduction of the very conditions that have formed and favored his vision of the world, and which therefore had given his type of feeling and thinking a chance of success. One day, these isolated cases will come into possession of their own methods for directing the future of humanity. Did Nietzsche believe in the efficacy of these methods, or rather did he simply want to transmit the states of his own soul in order to make sure others would have the means of reacting and acting under the worst conditions, thereby enabling them not only to defend themselves but also to counterattack? At the end of this first inquiry, Nietzsche posed a new question in a tone of voice that was completely foreign to all previous speculation. Who is the adversary? Who is the enemy to be destroyed? For the more thought can circumscribe its adversary, the more it can concentrate its strength. In determining the enemy, thought is able to create its own space, to extend it, to breathe freely. The enemy was not only Christianity, nor was it morality in itself, but a complex amalgam of the two. Philistinism is too weak a term, nor does bourgeoisism adequately describe the monstrous hydra, for it is made up of extraordinarily diverse tendencies and deceitful practices. It is in all things and in each thing, and Nietzsche himself had to struggle to free himself from the enemy, to eradicate all its germs, which he bore in himself like a hereditary sin. That was his first task. To explore the foundation of Western culture, and especially bourgeois culture, under the pretext of going deeper into it and making it bearable, always amounts to legitimating it in human terms. But any possible legitimation was undermined in advance once Nietzsche denounced a society founded on the ideological disavowal of the external constraints it necessarily exerts. The ideological disavowal of constraints is expressed through the concept of culture, and thus through a false interpretation of culture in a concept. The fact that modern society had merely formed a concept of culture is the proof of the disappearance of a lived culture. The conception of the Greek state formed by the young Nietzsche became a phantasm that was all the more obsessive in that it was incompatible with the concept of culture. Quote, that slavery belongs to the essence of a culture is a truth that leaves no doubt as to the absolute value of existence. For the Promethean instigator of culture, it is the vulture that gnaws at the liver, end quote. A lived culture, according to Nietzsche, can never have a gregarious foundation. It is the fact of the particular case, and thus from the viewpoint of the bourgeois concept of culture, a monstrosity. Though himself dependent on this concept, Nietzsche would nonetheless destroy it. Now, the concept of culture is like the concept of freedom. Both tend to cover over a specifically modern fact, the fact of experimentation. We will see later how experimentation restores the servitude that the concept of culture conjures away. Nietzsche summarized this in the following manner. There are forces present at the heart of an individual, struggles, and externalizable constraints. Which of them will be made into masters and which into slaves? Experimentation always involves an inventor, an experimented object, failures, successes, victims, and sacrificers. In 1871, well before he had passed through all the phases of his thought and discovered his own way of conceiving the meaning of successive Western cultures, Nietzsche had seen in the report of the burning of the Tuileries during the Commune an untenable argument for a traditional culture. He had written to Gersdorf, 21st June, 1871, quote, if we could discuss this together, we would agree that precisely in that phenomenon does our modern life, actually the whole of old Christian Europe and its state, but above all the Romanic civilization, which is now everywhere predominant, show the enormous degree to which our world has been damaged, and that with all our past behind us, we all bear the guilt that such a terror could come to light. So that we must make sure we do not ascribe to those unfortunates alone the crime of a combat against culture. I know what that means, the combat against culture. When I heard of the fires in Paris, I felt for several days annihilated and was overwhelmed by fears and doubts. The entire scholarly, scientific, philosophical, and artistic existence seemed an absurdity. If a single day could wipe out the most glorious works of art, even whole periods of art. I clung with earnest conviction to the metaphysical value of art, which cannot exist for the sake of impoverished people, but which has higher missions to fulfill. But even when the pain was at its worst, I could not cast a stone against those blasphemers, who were to me only carriers of the general guilt, which gives much food for thought, end quote. The young professor of philology of the 1870s was still reacting and expressing himself like an erudite bourgeois. Yet the cynicism of a phrase like the one in which he announces that art cannot exist for the sake of impoverished people points to his own critical use of irony, and he expresses his own condemnation in the beginning and ending lines. If art cannot exist for impoverished people, then the latter assume the guilt of its destruction, but they are simply manifestations of our own culture, our universal culture, which dissimulates our own iniquity in the guise of culture. To assume the crime of the combat against culture was an underlying theme of the young Nietzsche's still Hellenizing thinking. But this assumption was merely the obverse of a theme that would become more explicit in the years to come, to assume culture's crime against existing misery, which will finally put culture itself in question, a criminal culture. At first, this seems to be a totally aberrant vision. The communards never considered attacking art in the name of social misery. The way Nietzsche poses the problem here, after reading an erroneous news item, reveals exactly what he is himself admitting, a feeling of bourgeois guilt. But it is on the basis of this feeling that he poses the true problem. Am I guilty of enjoying the culture of which the impoverished class is deprived or not? What he means by our guilt, a guilt which, according to him, was ascribed to the arsonist's gesture, is to have allowed Christian and post-Christian morality to promote confusion, namely the illusion and hypocrisy of a culture that would have no social inequalities, whereas it is inequality alone which makes culture possible, inequality and struggle between different groups of affects. At the end of his short career, Nietzsche would side with the criminal as an irretrievable force, virtually superior to an order of things that excludes it. His refusal to cast a stone at the unfortunate communards, at the carriers of the general guilt, pointed both to an instructive, though still unavowed, solidarity, and to a problem unsolvable for the young Nietzsche in the terms thus posed: culture, social misery, crime, combat against culture. Quote, It was only very late that I was able to discover what, strictly speaking, I was absolutely lacking, namely justice. What is justice? Is it possible? And if it were not possible, how would life be bearable? This is what I was constantly asking myself, and when I delved into myself, I was deeply distressed to find nothing but passions everywhere, perspectives from a determinate angle, the thoughtlessness, irreflexion, of everything that is deprived of the prior conditions of justice in advance. But where, then, was reflection? Reflection from a vast perspicuity. The only thing I could attribute to myself was courage and a certain durability, the fruit of a long domination of myself." End quote. As long as culture implies slavery and is the product of unavowed slavery, the problem of guilt persists. Does living in a culture mean that one wills slavery? What would happen to culture if slavery were suppressed? Would culture have to be extended to each and every person? Will we then have a culture of slaves? But this, it seems, is a false problem. Culture is the product of the slave, and having produced culture, he is now its conscious master. This is what Hegel demonstrated. Footnote. We are following, in broad outlines, Alexander Kojève's remarkable exegesis of this passage from the Phenomenology of Spirit in his introduction to the reading of Hegel. End footnote. Nietzsche is the incorrigible beneficiary of this culture, but for Nietzsche, the slave who has become the master of culture is nothing other than Christian morality. And because the latter will be prolonged in certain forms of communality, first in the form of bourgeois culture and then in the socializing form of industrialization, Nietzsche, out of his own ignorance, will attack the Hegelian dialectic at its roots. Footnote. It was the intimidating genius of Georges Bataille in Inner Experience that emphasized this ignorance in the genealogy of morals. For the relationship between Nietzsche and Hegel, see Gilles Deleuze's magisterial study, Nietzsche and Philosophy. End footnote. So, Nietzsche, out of his own ignorance, will attack the Hegelian dialectic at its roots. In his analysis of the unhappy consciousness, Hegel distorts the initial desire, the will to power. The autonomous consciousness of the master despairs of ever having its autonomy recognized by another autonomous being, since it is necessarily constituted by a dependent consciousness, that of the slave. In Nietzsche, there is no such need for reciprocity. This is his ignorance of this passage of the dialectic. On the contrary, given his own idiosyncrasy, the sovereignty of an incommunicable emotion, the very idea of a consciousness for itself mediated by another consciousness, remains foreign to Nietzsche. Sovereignty lies in the arbitrary manner by which one feels existence, which can be enriched through hostile resistance or increased through the emotion of an accomplice. The slave renounces his emotion and opposes it to labor, which diverts him from the emotion and justifies him against the arbitrary. To the degree that he does not renounce his idiosyncrasy, objectivation, the liberator of the emotion, is increased all the more in the one who does not seek an equivalent to his madness. The entire cultural, historical, and human world that the servile consciousness had begun to construct under the constraint of the autonomous consciousness, and through which the servile consciousness in turn becomes autonomous and triumphs over the consciousness of the master, in short, the world of culture. It was precisely against this world, against this culture, of which he was both the product and the beneficiary, that Nietzsche rebelled. Nietzsche led this objectivation of the servile consciousness in the cultural world back to its source. Yet the reproduction of the world of affects through art has been possible only thanks to this historical and cultural world constructed by the servile consciousness. Is not art evidence of a consciousness that has become autonomous? But a new servitude now reigns over this fact, for the historical and human world has not managed to silence the affects. In order for this newly autonomous consciousness to triumph completely over the initial desire represented by the idleness of the master, it was necessary for art to disappear, and we will see to what degree Nietzsche foresees its disappearance in the industrial plans of the future, and for the affects to be swallowed up entirely in the fabrication of exchangeable products. As long as these affects remain and presuppose idleness, do they necessarily require the servitude of a large number of people? But this is where the problem becomes displaced, for the affects are themselves enslaved by other affects, and not, at least not initially, by the affects of other individuals, but by those within the same individual. And for Nietzsche, gregarious means servile. Nietzsche will remain within this perspective of a guilty culture up to the time he puts consciousness and its categories in question, in the name of the world of affects. Until then, there will always be carriers of the general guilt of a culture that masks the antinomies of bourgeois morality. In his phantasm, Nietzsche saw the marvels of the Louvre in flames. What was important were not the marvels, but the emotions that lay at their origin. For these emotions make inequality prevail, and if inequality makes life unbearable, then courage and endurance are required to bear it. Quote, to give men back the courage of their natural drives, to check their self-underestimation, not that of man as an individual, but that of man as nature. To remove antitheses from things after comprehending that we have projected them there. To remove the idiosyncrasies of society from existence. Guilt, punishment, justice, honesty, freedom, love, etc. End quote. Thus Nietzsche, in turn, undertook his own combat against culture, in the name of a culture of the affects, which would be built on the ruins of the hypostases of consciousness and its antinomies, insofar as they are born from the guilt of consciousness toward itself, which will propel it toward the totality of spirit. This culture of affects will be possible only after a progressive dislocation of the substructures that are elaborated in language. Toward the middle of the years 1880 to 8, Nietzsche retraced the stages of his own moral itinerary in a concise manner. Quote, how long have I already sought to prove to myself the perfect innocence of becoming? How many singular paths has this already taken me down? At first it seemed to me that the just solution was simply to decree existence as something similar to art does not fall under the jurisdiction of morality. Furthermore, morality itself belongs to the domain of phenomena. Next I said to myself, every concept of guilt is objectively devoid of value, but subjectively every life is necessarily unjust and illogical. Finally, the third time I took on myself the negation of my aim, from the fact of experiencing the unknowability of any causal chain. And why all this? Was it not in order to procure for myself the feeling of total irresponsibility, to situate myself outside of all praise and all blame, completely independent of yesterday and today, in order to pursue my own aim in my own manner? End quote. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The valetudinary states at the origin of a semiotic of impulses. The euphoria that gripped Nietzsche after each of his crises, from 1877 to 1881, led him to scrutinize ever more carefully the forces that had been revealed through the disturbances of his organism. He gave them free rein, during which time he returned to his notebooks and submitted them to his vocabulary. A series was thereby formed, a group of reflections on certain aspects of history, on certain arguments of scientists or thinkers or artists, on certain gestures of politicians, all of which, depending on the diverse level they represented, seemed to bear witness, actively or passively, to the same forces that had just given Nietzsche's brain, his organism, a short respite. The anger, tenderness, impatience, or calm he experienced, in the context of certain motives and circumstances, were already sanctioned by received terms, yet the afflux or reflux of these forces, their tension or relaxation, could find an apparent outlet only by being translated into words, images, reasonings, or refutations. For a moment arrived when they would again become muddled, intermingling and obscuring each other. They had been diverted, they had deviated, far from an aim, and neither history, nor science, nor investigation, nor even the forms of art converged upon this aim. The writing stopped, the words were effaced, and a new and terrifying aggression exerted itself on Nietzsche's brain. It may seem absurd to read Nietzsche's successive texts as so many migraines inverted in words. Given the way Nietzsche was compelled to describe the various phases of his conscious states, however, he was unable to avoid the mechanism of such an inversion. For a long period of time, and well before the positivist critique of human all too human, Nietzsche had dismissed the intelligible in itself, yet he could neither attack it in consciousness nor speak in the name of the unspoken. This is why he remained dependent for so long on the problem of culture posed by his vision of Greek tragedy. The birth of tragedy, out of the spirit of music, had served merely to make explicit, in a prestigious manner, the Hellenizing aspect of his secret phantasm, the search for a culture that would accord with the forces of the unspoken. He would use this phantasm to protect himself from the forces of inertia as much as he would use it to influence other minds, with all the ambiguity such a project implies. Within the circle of his acquaintances, Nietzsche's vision of the Hellenic state had appalled Wagner, and Rode as well. It was his encounter with Ray, a disabused spirit, that encouraged a demystifying tendency in him. But the furious assaults of his illness would soon throw him back into a period of isolation, which further encouraged his contemplative states and an ever greater abandonment to the tonalities of his soul. It was during one such moment, in the month of August 1881 at Sils Maria, that the ecstasy of the eternal return would surprise him. Correspondence. To Gast. St. Moritz, 11 September 1879. I am at the end of my 35th year. The middle of life, as people for a millennium and a half have said of this age. It was at this age that Dante had his vision, and in the opening lines of his poem he mentions the fact. Now I am in the middle of life, and so encircled by death, that at any minute it can lay hold of me. From the nature of my sufferings I must reckon upon a sudden death through convulsions, although I should prefer 100 times a slow, lucid death before which I should be able to converse with my friends, even if it were more painful. In this way I feel like the oldest of men, even from the standpoint of having completed my life task. I have poured a salutary drop of oil, this I know, and I shall not be forgotten for it. At bottom I have already undergone the test of my own view of life. Many more will have to do it after me. Up to the present, my spirit has not been depressed by the unremitting suffering that my ailments have caused me. At times I even feel more cheerful and more benevolent than I ever felt in my life before. To what do I owe this invigorating and ameliorating effect? Certainly not to my fellow men. For, with but a few exceptions, they have all during the last few years shown themselves offended by me, nor have they shrunk from letting me know it. Just read this last manuscript through, my dear friend, and ask yourself whether there are any traces of suffering or depression to be found in it. I don't believe there are, and this very belief is a sign that there must be powers concealed in these views, and not the proofs of impotence and lassitude after which my enemies will seek. I shall not come to you myself, however urgently the Overbecks and my sister may press me to do so. There are states in which it seems to me more fitting to return to the neighborhood of one's mother, one's home, and the memories of one's childhood. But do not take all this as final and irrevocable. According as his hopes rise or fall, an invalid should be allowed to make or unmake his plans. My program for the summer is complete. 3 weeks at a moderate altitude in Weissen, 3 months in Engadine, and the last month in taking the real St. Moritz drink cure, the best effect of which is not supposed to be felt before the winter. This working out of a program was a pleasure to me, but it was not easy. Self-denial in everything. I had no friends, no company. I could read no books. All art was removed from me. A small bedroom with a bed. The food of an ascetic, which, by the way, suited me excellently, for I have had no indigestion the whole of the summer. This self-denial was complete except for one point. I gave myself up to my thoughts. What else could I do? Of course, this was the very worst thing for my head, but I still do not see how I could have avoided it. But enough, this winter my program will be to recover from myself, to rest myself away from my thoughts. For years I have not had this experience. To Gast, 5 October 1879. You would not believe with what fidelity I have carried out the program of thoughtlessness so far. I have reasons for fidelity here, for behind thought stands the devil of a tormenting attack of pain. The manuscript which you received from St. Moritz was written at such a high and hard price that perhaps nobody would have written it if he could possibly have avoided doing so. Often I shudder to read it, especially the longer parts, because of the ugly memories it brings. All of it, except for a few lines, was thought out on walks, and it was sketched out in pencil in 6 small notebooks. The fair copy made me ill almost every time I set about writing it. I had to omit about 20 longish thought sequences, unfortunately quite essential ones, because I could not find the time to extract them from my frightful pencil scribblings. The same was true last summer. In the interim, the connections between the thoughts escape my memory. I have to steal the minutes and quarter hours of brain energy, as you call it, steal them away from a suffering brain. Sometimes I think that I shall never do it again. I am reading the copy you made and find it difficult to understand myself. My head is that tired. To Malvida von Meisenburg, 14th January 1880. Although writing is for me one of the most forbidden fruits, yet I must write a letter to you, whom I love and respect like an elder sister, and it will probably be the last. For my life's terrible and almost unremitting martyrdom makes me thirst for the end, and there have been some signs which allow me to hope that the stroke which will liberate me is not too distant. As regards torment and self-denial, my life during these past years can match that of any ascetic of any time. Nevertheless, I have wrung from these years much in the way of purification and burnishing of the soul, and I no longer need religion or art as a means to that end. You will notice that I am proud of this. In fact, complete isolation alone enabled me to discover my own resources of self-help. I think that I have done my life's work, though of course like a person who had no time. But I know that I have poured out a drop of good oil for many, in that I have given to many an indication of how to rise above themselves, how to attain equanimity and a right mind. I write this as an afterthought. Really, it should only be said on the completion of my humanity. No pain has been, or should be able, to make me bear false witness about life as I know it to be. To Dr. O. Iser, early January 1880. To dare write a letter, I have to wait 4 weeks for a tolerable moment, after which I still have to pay for it. My existence is a dreadful burden. I would have rejected it long ago had I not been making the most instructive experiments in the intellectual and moral domain in just this condition of suffering and almost complete renunciation. This joyous mood, avid for knowledge, raised me to heights where I triumphed over every torture and all despair. On the whole, I am happier now than I have ever been in my life, and yet continual pain. For many hours of the day, a sensation closely akin to seasickness, a semi-paralysis that makes it difficult to speak, alternating with furious attacks. The last one made me vomit for 3 days and 3 nights. I longed for death. I can't read, rarely write, visit no one, can't listen to music. I keep to myself and take walks in the rarefied air, a diet of eggs and milk. No pain-relieving remedies work. The cold is harmful to me. In the coming weeks, I will go south to begin my existence as a walker. My only consolation is my thoughts and perspectives. In the course of my wanderings, I now and then scribble something on a piece of paper. I write nothing at my work table. Friends decipher my scribblings. My last product, which my friends wound up completing, will follow. Accept it gladly, even if it does not conform to your own way of thinking. I do not seek disciples. Believe me, I enjoy my freedom and wish this joy to all those who have the right to spiritual freedom. I have already lost consciousness several times. During the spring of last year at Basel, they had given up all hope for me. My sight has visibly worsened since my last consultation. To Overbeck, Genoa, November 1880. Now my whole endeavor is to realize an ideal attic-dweller's solitude, which will do justice to all those necessary and most elementary demands of my nature, as many, many torments have taught me to know them. And perhaps I shall succeed. The daily struggle against my head trouble and the laughable complexity of my distresses demand so much attention that I am in danger of becoming petty in this regard. Well, that is the counterweight to very general, very lofty impulses, which have such control over me that without the counterweight I would make a fool of myself. I have just come round from a very grueling attack, and having hardly shaken off the distress of the past 2 days, I find my foolery already pursuing quite incredible things. From the moment I wake up, and I think that no other attic dweller can have had the dawn shine upon more lovely and more desirable things. To his mother, Sils Maria, mid-July 1881. My nervous system is splendid in view of the immense work it has to do. It is quite sensitive, but very strong, a source of astonishment to me. Even the long and severe maladies, an occupation which did not suit me, and a dead wrong treatment have not harmed it basically. Indeed, within the past year, it has become stronger, and owing to it I have produced one of the most daring, the sublimest and deepest of books ever spawned by a human brain and heart. Even had I committed suicide in Recoro, a man would have died who was the most indomitable and absolutely superior, not one who had given up in despair. With respect to the scientific material I require, I am in a better position than any and all physicians. More yet, my scientific pride is offended when you are suggesting that I should submit to new treatments and even express the opinion that I did not do anything for my sickness. You should have a little more confidence in these matters. Up to now, I have been under my own governance for only 2 years, and if I did make any mistakes, it was always owing to the fact that I ultimately yielded to the earnest entreaties of others and submitted to experimentation. In this category belong my stays in Momberg, in Marienbad, etc. Moreover, every competent physician has prognosticated my recovery, but not before a number of years has elapsed. Above all, I must try and get rid of the grave after-effects of all these wrong methods, by which I have been treated for such a long time. I implore you, don't be angry with me if I seem to reject your love and sympathy in this manner. I fully intend to continue henceforth as my own physician. Moreover, people shall say, after I am dead, that I was a good physician, and not only in my behalf. Be that as it may, I shall still have to look forward to many, many periods of illness. Do not become impatient the while, I beg of you with all my heart. This makes me more irritable than the sickness itself, because it demonstrates to me that my nearest relatives display so little faith in me. Whoever could secretly look on me as I am practicing combining my concern for my own recovery with promoting my great tasks would pay me no mean compliment. End of correspondence. Whatever the origin of Nietzsche's migraines, hereditary as he himself sometimes seemed to believe, or accidentally syphilitic as the various cross-checkings of later witnesses tried to establish, and from which Jaspers concluded that Nietzsche's delirium was characterized by a general paralysis, the fact remains that, from the outset, the illness periodically struck Nietzsche in the cerebral organ. Nietzsche often took long walks on foot. His thoughts came to him step by step, and then he would return home and work on the notes he had written in pencil outdoors. The migraines then appeared, sometimes affecting his vision. At times he was unable to reread his notes and would leave the task to his friends. Peter Gast, in this way, learned how to decipher his illegible handwriting. Nietzsche was often forced to give up all reading, all writing, all reflection. He followed a treatment, a diet. He changed climate. Moreover, he distrusted therapeutics. Little by little, he managed to invent a therapy of his own, derived from his own observations. Once he recovered his faculties, he tried to describe this suspension of thought, to reflect on the cerebral functioning in relation to other organic functions, and he began to distrust his own brain. The act of thinking became identical with suffering, and suffering with thinking. From this fact, Nietzsche posited the coincidence of thought with suffering, and asked what a thought would be that was deprived of suffering. Thinking suffering, reflecting on past suffering as the impossibility of thinking, then came to be experienced by Nietzsche as the highest joy. But does thought really have the power to actualize itself without itself suffering, without reconstituting its own suffering? Does thought itself suffer from its own inability to actualize itself? What then is doing the suffering or enjoying? The brain? Can the cerebral organ enjoy the suffering of the body, of which it is a function? Can the body rejoice in the suffering of its supreme organ? Quote, "It was then he felt most healthy and most robust, in complete control of his creative powers, that he came closest to his illness. And it was the forced rest and idleness that would again allow him to recover and to keep the catastrophe in suspense." End quote, Lou A. Salome. If the body concerns our most immediate forces as those which, in terms of their origin, are the most distant, then everything the body says, its well-being, as well as its diseases, gives us the best information about our destiny. Nietzsche therefore wanted to go back toward what, in himself, was most distant in order to comprehend the most immediate. Before describing how one becomes what one is, Nietzsche first put in question what one is. He never hesitated to say that certain of his books were written while his health was at such and such a point. For example, at the moment he felt it to be at its lowest point. The agonizing migraines which Nietzsche experienced periodically as an aggression that suspended his thought were not an external aggression. The root of evil was in himself, in his own organism. His own physical self was attacking in order to defend itself against a dissolution. But what was being threatened with dissolution? Nietzsche's own brain. Whenever his migraines subsided, Nietzsche would put his state of respite in the service of this dissolution. For the dissolution was judged to be such only by the brain, for whom the physical self and the moral self apparently coincide. But the body provided Nietzsche with a completely different perspective, namely, the perspective of active forces which, as organic and therefore subordinate functions, expressed a will to break with this servitude. But they could do so only if this will passed through the brain. The brain, on the other hand, could experience this will only as its own subordination to these dissolving forces. It was threatened with the impossibility of thinking. Nietzsche experienced this dissolving confrontation between somatic and spiritual forces for a long time, and he observed it passionately. The more he listened to his body, the more he came to distrust the person the body supports. His obsessive fear of suicide, born out of the despair that his atrocious migraines would never be cured, amounted to a condemnation of the body, in the name of the person being diminished by it. But the thought that he had not yet finished his life's work gave him the fortitude to side with the body. If the body is presently in pain, if the brain is sending nothing but distress signals, it is because a language is trying to make itself heard at the price of reason. A suspicion, a hatred, a rage against his own conscious and reasonable person was born. This person, fashioned by a particular epoch, in a familial milieu he increasingly abhorred, is not what he wanted to conserve. He would destroy the person out of a love for the nervous system he knew he had been gifted with, and in which he took a certain pride. By studying the reactions of his nervous system, he would come to conceive of himself in a different manner than he had previously known, and indeed in a manner that will perhaps never again be known. Consequently, he developed a mode of intelligence which he wanted to submit to exclusively physical criteria. He not only interpreted suffering as energy, but willed it to be so. Physical suffering would be livable only insofar as it was closely connected to joy, insofar as it developed a voluptuous lucidity. Either it would extinguish all possible thought, or it would reach the delirium of thought. But he sensed yet another trap in serenity. Is a thought freed from all physical oppression something real? No, for other impulses are in the process of taking delight in it. And more often than not, such a delight is merely a report of the absence of such sufferings, which have apparently been overcome, and hence their representation. Serenity is merely a kind of armistice between irreconcilable impulses. There seems to be a strict correlation between the phenomenon of pain, which is experienced by the organism as the aggression of an invading external power, and the biological process that leads to the formation of the brain. Footnote. In the domain of animal biology, the formation of the brain presupposes an exploratory progression, of which the brain is the instrument. In Nietzsche, there is a tendency to liberate the exploration in relation to the instrument, inasmuch as the latter would subordinate what is acquired in the exploration to its limited functional ends. This is why he aspires to a decentralization, and thus to a ubiquity, whence also his rejection of a system of thought. End footnote. The brain, which concentrates all the reflexes on fighting the aggression, is able to represent the inflicted pain as degrees of excitations oscillating between pain and pleasure. The brain can have representations only if it meticulously spiritualizes the elementary excitations into the danger of pain or the good fortune of pleasure, a discharge that may or may not result in further excitations. But the painful excitation can form a satisfaction that is itself experienced as pain to the degree that it upsets an equilibrium that had been momentarily attained by the organism, an equilibrium that in a prior state it was able to experience as a joy. This prior satisfaction of the excitation leaves a trace of intensity in the brain, which can then reactualize it as joy of re-excitation, by the act of representing it to itself. But Nietzsche supposes that this excitation is then being exercised on another self, moi. The body wants to make itself understood through the intermediary of a language of signs that is fallaciously deciphered by consciousness. Consciousness itself constitutes this code of signs that inverts, falsifies, and filters what is expressed through the body. Consciousness is itself nothing other than a deciphering of the messages transmitted by the impulses. The deciphering is in itself an inversion of the message, which is now attributed to the individual. Since everything leads to the head, the upright position, the message is deciphered in a way that will maintain this vertical position. There would be no message as such if this position were not habitual and specific. Meaning is formed in the upright position, and in accordance with its own criteria: high, low, before, after. Nietzsche did not speak on behalf of a hygiene of the body established by reason. He spoke on behalf of corporeal states as the authentic data that consciousness must conjure away in order to be an individual. This viewpoint far surpasses a purely physiological conception of life. The body is a product of chance. It is nothing but the locus, where a group of individuated impulses confront each other so as to produce this interval that constitutes a human life, impulses whose sole ambition is to de-individuate themselves. What is born from this chance association of impulses is not only the individual they constitute at the whims of circumstance, but also the eminently deceptive principle of a cerebral activity that progressively disengages itself from sleep. Consciousness seems to oscillate continually between somnolence and insomnia, and what we call the waking state is merely the comparison of the two, their reciprocal reflection, like a play of mirrors. But there is no mirror without a tane, and it is this tane that forms the ground of reason. Forgetfulness is possible only because of the opacity of the impulses. There is no consciousness without forgetfulness, but once it scratches the tane, consciousness itself, in its very transparency, merges with the flux and reflux of the impulses. The body, insofar as it is grasped by consciousness, dissociates itself from the impulses that flow through it, and which, having come together fortuitously, continue to sustain the body in an equally fortuitous manner. The organ that these impulses have developed at the highest extremity of the body considers this fortuitous yet obvious sustenance to be necessary for its conservation. Its cerebral activity therefore selects only those forces that preserve this activity, or rather those that can be assimilated to it. And the body adopts only those reflexes that allow it to maintain itself for this cerebral activity, just as the latter henceforth adopts the body as its own product. To To understand Nietzsche, it is important to see this reversal brought about by the organism. The most fragile organ it has developed comes to dominate the body, one might say, because of its very fragility. The cerebral activity, thanks to which the human body adopts the upright position, winds up reducing the body's presence to an automatism. The body as body is no longer synonymous with itself, strictly speaking. As an instrument of consciousness, it becomes the homonym of the person. As soon as the cerebral activity diminishes, the body alone remains present. But in reality, it no longer belongs to a person. Although it retains all the reflexes from which one and the same person could be reconstructed, the person is absent from it. The more these purely corporeal manifestations assert themselves, the more the return of the person seems to be delayed. The latter sleeps, dreams, laughs, or trembles, but these states are revealed in the body alone. The person can represent to itself the fact that it is laughing, trembling, enjoying, or suffering through an evocation of motives, but these are only an interpretation of corporeal sensations. The person that claims these symptoms as its own, when communicating with itself or with another person, can do so only before or after they have been produced. It can deny that it has been their subject consciously, and it can consent to retain them as its own only if they seem to conform to what it takes to be its normal state, namely, to anything compatible with the upright position of the body or any other position that would depend on its decisions or representations. The person can decide to laugh, or to abandon itself to the reflex of laughter, or to the reflex of pain or fatigue. But in every such case, the decisions are only the result of an excited or excitable state. They are thus subsequent to the excitation rather than prior to it. In the intensity of pain or pleasure, and especially in voluptuousness, the person disappears for a moment, and what remains of consciousness at that point is strictly limited to the corporeal symptoms that its very structure inverts. The notion of the unconscious is here nothing more than an image of forgetfulness, the forgetfulness of everything that owes its origin to the upright position. Every human being can lie down, but it lies down because it is certain that it will always remain the same, and that it will be able to get back up or change position. It always believes itself to be in its own body, but its own body is only the fortuitous encounter of contradictory impulses, temporarily reconciled. I am sick in a body that does not belong to me. My suffering is only an interpretation of the struggle between certain functions or impulses that have been subjugated by the organism and are now rivals, those which depend on me and those which escape my control. Conversely, the physical agent of myself, le support physique de moi-même, seems to reject any thoughts I have that no longer ensure its own cohesion, thoughts that proceed from a state that is foreign or contrary to that required by the physical agent, which is nonetheless identical to myself. But what then is the identity of the self? It seems to depend on the irreversible history of the body, a linkage of causes and effects. But this linkage is pure appearance. The body is constantly being modified so as to form one and the same physiognomy, and it is only when the resources for the body's rejuvenation are impoverished that the person becomes fixed and its character hardens. But the different ages of the body are all so many different states, each giving birth to the next. The body is the same body only insofar as a single self is able to and wills to be merged with it, with all its vicissitudes. The cohesion of the body is that of the self. The body produces this self and hence its own cohesion. But for itself this body dies and is reborn numerous times. Deaths and rebirths that the self pretends to survive in its illusory cohesion. In reality, the ages of the body are simply the impulsive movements that form and deform it, and finally tend to abandon it. But just as these impulses are resources for the body, they are also threats to its cohesion. The purely functional cohesion of the body in the service of the self's identity is in this sense irreversible. The ages of the self are those of the body's cohesion, which means that the more this self begins to age in and with the body, and the more it aspires to cohesion, the more it also seeks to return to its starting point, and thus to recapitulate itself. The dread of physical dissolution requires a retrospective vision of its own cohesion. Thus, because the self, as a product of the body, attributes this body to itself as its own, and is unable to create another, the self, too, has its own irreversible history. The identity of the self, along with that of its own body, is inseparable from a direction or meaning, sense, formed by the irreversible course of a human life. It experiences this direction or meaning as its own accomplishment, once the eternity of meaning once and for all. There is, in Nietzsche, an initial conception of fatality that implies this irreversible course, insofar as the self cannot escape from it. At first sight, this love for the fatum, and hence for the irreversible, seems to have been Nietzsche's primary imperative. But beginning with the experience of the eternal return, which announced a break with this irreversible once and for all, Nietzsche also developed a new version of fatality, that of the vicious circle, which suppresses every goal and meaning, since the beginning and the end always merge with each other. From this point on, Nietzsche would no longer be concerned with the body as a property of the self, but with the body as the locus of impulses, the locus of their confrontation. Since it is a product of the impulses, the body becomes fortuitous. It is neither irreversible nor reversible, because its only history is that of the impulses. These impulses come and go, and the circular movement they describe is made manifest as much in moods as in thought, as much in the tonalities of the soul as in corporeal depressions, which are moral only insofar as the declarations and judgments of the self recreate in language a property that is in itself inconsistent and hence empty. But despite all this, Nietzsche would not forego cohesion. He struggled at one and the same time with the to and fro movement of the impulses and for a new cohesion between his thought and the body as a corporealizing thought. To do this, he followed what he called, in several places, the guiding thread of the body. By examining the alternations in his own valetudinary states, he sought to follow this Ariadne's thread through the labyrinth of the impulses. Convalescence was the signal of a new offensive of the body, this rethought body, against the thinking Nietzsche self. This in turn paved the way for a new relapse. For Nietzsche, each of these relapses, up until the final relapse, heralded a new inquiry and a new investment in the world of the impulses, and in each case he paid the price of an ever-worsening illness. In each case, the body liberated itself a little more from its own agent, and in each case this agent was weakened a little more. Little by little, the brain was forced to approach the boundaries that separated it from these somatic forces, in that the reawakening of the self in the brain was brought about ever more slowly. And even when it occurred, it was these same forces that seized hold of the functional mechanism. The self was broken down into a lucidity that was more vast but more brief. The equilibrium of the functions was reversed. The self lay dormant in words, in the fixity of signs, and the forces were awakened all the more in that they still remained silent. And memory finally was detached from the cerebral self, a memory that could no longer designate itself except in accordance with its most distant motifs. How can the body subtract the cerebral activity from what we call the self? And first of all, how is the self re-established by the brain? There is no other way than by passing through the limit that is constantly redrawn in and by the waking state. But the waking state never lasts more than a few seconds. At every instant, the brain is flooded by excitations of greater or lesser intensity, excitations whose overwhelming reception must constantly be filtered. The new excitations are filtered through the traces of prior excitations which have already been absorbed. But the new excitations can be coordinated with prior ones only through assimilation, namely by comparing what is habitual with what is foreign. As a result, the limit cannot help but be effaced. After a few seconds, a large part of the brain is already dormant. Any decision or resolution made to not think an action so as to be able to execute it presumes that only the trace of prior excitations is admitted, which assures the permanence of the self's identity. Thanks to the body's muteness, we appropriate the body for ourselves in order to remain upright. We create for ourselves an image of a meaning or a goal that we pursue in our thoughts and actions, namely, to remain the same as what we believe ourselves to be. To restore these corporealizing forces, impulses, to thought, amounts to an expropriation of the agent, of the self. Yet Nietzsche brought about this restoration and expropriation through his brain. He used his lucidity to penetrate the shadows. But how can one remain lucid if one destroys the locus of lucidity, namely the self? What would this consciousness be without an agent? How can memory subsist if it has to deal with things that no longer belong to the self? How can we remember as a being that can remember everything except itself? Nietzsche's researches in the biological and physiological sciences stemmed from a double preoccupation. First, to find a mode of behavior in the organic and inorganic world that was analogous to his own valetudinary state, and second, based on this mode of behavior, to find the arguments and resources that would allow him to recreate himself beyond his own self. Physiology, as he understood it, would thus provide him with the premises of a liberatory conception of the forces that lay subjacent not only to his own condition, but also to the various situations he was living through in the context of his epoch. Nietzsche's investigations into science had the same aim as his investigations into art or into contemporary and past political events. This is why he resorted to various terminologies, to which he gave increasingly equivocal turns of phrase. When borrowing from the various disciplines, he gave them his own emphases, and pursued a vision that escaped them, a vision which, because of its experimental character, lacked any objective consideration. Since the body is the self, soi, footnote, the selbst for Nietzsche has a double meaning. On the one hand, it is, morally speaking, the Selbstsucht, the greediness of the self, which is erroneously translated as egoism, and on the other hand, it is force, unconscious to the cerebral consciousness, which obeys a hidden reason. End footnote. Since the body is the self resides in the midst of the body and expresses itself through the body. For Nietzsche, this was already a fundamental position. Everything his brain had refused him lay hidden in his corporeal life, this intelligence that was larger than the seat of the intelligence. All evil and suffering are the result of the quarrel between the body's multiplicity, with its millions of vague impulses, and the interpretative stubbornness of the meaning bestowed on it by the brain. It is from the body, from the self, that every creative force and every evaluation arises, and it is from their cerebral inversion that mortal specters are born, starting with a voluntary ego, a mind deprived of itself. Likewise, the other person, the neighbor, is nothing but a projection of the self through the inversions of the mind. The you, toi, has no more reality than the me, moi, except as a pure modification of the self, soi. The self finally exists in the body only as a prolonged extremity of chaos. Impulses take on an organic and individualized form only when delegated by chaos. It was this delegation that now became Nietzsche's interlocutor. From high in the cerebral citadel, besieged, it is called madness. Once the body is recognized as the product of the impulses, subjected, organized, hierarchized, its cohesion with the self becomes fortuitous. The impulses can be put to use by a new body, and are presupposed in the search for new conditions. Starting from these impulses, Nietzsche suspected that beyond the cerebral intellect, there lies an intellect that is infinitely more vast than the one that merges with our consciousness. Quote, perhaps the entire evolution of the spirit is a question of the body. It is the history of the development of a higher body that emerges into our sensibility. The organic is rising to yet higher levels. Our lust for knowledge of nature is a means through which the body desires to perfect itself. Or rather, hundreds of thousands of experiments are made to change the nourishment, the mode of living, and the dwelling of the body, consciousness and evaluations of the body. All kinds of pleasure and displeasure are signs of these changes and experiments. In the long run, it is not a question of man at all. He is to be overcome. End quote. Quote, clear out the inner world. There are still many false beings in it. Sensation and thought are enough for me. The will as a third reality is imaginary. Moreover, all the impulses, desire, repulsion, etc. are not unities, but apparent simple states. Hunger, it is a feeling of discomfort and a knowledge of the means to suppress it. Similarly, without any knowledge, a series of movements can take place in the organism whose aim is to suppress hunger. The stimulation of this mechanism is felt at the same time as the hunger. End quote. Quote, just as organs develop in multiple ways from a single organ, such as the brain and the nervous system from the epidermis, so it was necessary for all feeling, representing, and thinking to have been one at the beginning. Sensation is thus an isolated late phenomenon. This unity must exist in the inorganic, for the organic begins by separation. The reciprocal action between the inorganic and the organic still needs to be studied. It is always a question of an action at a distance, in the long term. Hence, a knowing is necessary prior to all acting. What is distant must be perceived. The tactile and muscular sense must have its analog. End quote. Quote, consciousness localized at the surface of the two hemispheres. Every experience is a mechanical and chemical fact that cannot be stopped, but which lives, except that we know nothing of it. End quote. Quote, "Wherever there is life, we assume there is mind. But the mind, as we know it, is completely incapable of effectuating anything whatsoever. How miserable is every image of consciousness! No doubt it itself will merely be the effect of a modification, which then brings about another modification, action. Every action we will is simply represented by us as the appearance of the phenomenon, Schein der Erscheinung. All consciousness is nothing but a marginal expression of the intellect. What becomes conscious in us cannot reveal the cause of anything. We should compare our digestion with our sensations of it." End quote. Quote, "Our intellect is completely incapable of grasping the diversity of an intelligent synthetic interaction, not to mention producing one, like the digestive process. It is the synthetic interaction of several intellects. Wherever I find life, I find this synthetic interaction, and there is also a sovereign in these numerous intellects. But as soon as we seek to comprehend organic actions that would be executed with the assistance of several intellects, they become completely incomprehensible. We should rather conceive of the intellect itself as a final consequence of the organic." End quote. Quote, "The essence of heredity is totally obscure to us. Why does an action become easier the second time around? And who experiences that it is made easier? And does this sensation have anything in common with the fact that the action is effectuated in the same manner the second time? Would the sensation of different possible actions then have to be represented before acting?" End quote. Quote, "The powerful organic principle seems essential to me because of the ease by which it incorporates inorganic substances. I do not see how this finality could be explained simply by intensification. I believe rather that there are eternally organic beings." End quote. Quote, "Here is our way of being unequal. Your mind is devoid of a self, whereas mine has a complete self and is a mind only in word." End quote. Quote, "This is how I once spoke. Meaning and the mind are tools and toys. Behind them still lies the self. But when I looked for a self behind these other minds, all I found were minds devoid of a self." End quote. Quote, "Listen to me a moment, O Zarathustra," a disciple said to him one day. "Something is turning around in my head. Or rather, I would be prepared to believe that my head is turning around something, and thus that it describes a circle. What then is our neighbor? Something within us, some modification of ourselves that have become conscious. An image, this is what our neighbor is. What are we ourselves? Are we not also nothing but an image? A something within us, modifications of ourselves that have become conscious? Ourself of which we are conscious, is it not an image as well? Something outside of us, something external on the outside? We never touch anything but an image, and not ourselves, not ourself. Are we not strangers to ourselves, and also as close to ourselves as our neighbor? In truth, we have an image of humanity, which we have made out of ourselves, and then we apply it to ourselves in order to understand ourselves. Ah yes, to understand. Our understanding of ourselves goes from bad to worse. Our strongest feelings, inasmuch as they are feelings, are only something external, outside us, imagistic. Similitudes, that's what they are. And what we habitually call the inner world, alas, for the most part it is poor and deceptive and invented and hollow." End quote. Let us take at their word Nietzsche's physiological ideas concerning the relationships between thought and willing, and on the formation of meaning in a given declaration. Moreover, let us try to understand how, given his notion that conscious life is subordinated to fluctuations of intensities, he explains what we call an intention and a goal at the level of consciousness, and what this latter term signifies in relation to the term unconsciousness. What do these terms refer to in Nietzsche? Are they different from the term conscious and unconscious in Freud's sense of the iceberg? For it would seem that neither consciousness nor unconsciousness, nor willing or non-willing, have ever existed. Within a system of designating fluctuations, there is only a discontinuity between silence and declarations in the agent. Inasmuch as exteriority is installed in the agent by the code of everyday signs, it is only on the basis of this code that the agent can make declarations or state opinions, think or not think, remain silent or break its silence. The agent thinks only as a product of this code. Now such a thinking agent exists only because of the greater or lesser resistance of the impulsive forces, which constitutes the agent as a corporeal unity with respect to the code of everyday signs. By what measure can we say that the agent is conscious of not speaking, of remaining silent, of acting or not acting, of deciding or remaining undecided? Only in terms of a more or less unequal exchange between the impulses and the signs of the everyday code. But is not the agent unconscious of what these impulses are willing for themselves? Hence the inequality of the exchange, and the fact that the impulses lose out in the transaction. An intention is formed through the signs, minus their impulsive intensity. The intensity oscillates while thought as such is being formed, but once the declaration is produced, it is reduced to the inertia of signs. Where then does the ebbing flow of the intensity go? It overflows the fixity of signs and continues on, as it were, in their intervals. Each interval, thus each silence, belongs, outside the linkage of signs, to the fluctuations of an impulsive intensity. Is this the unconscious? In itself, the term is merely a designation of the code of everyday signs that is applied afterward. What then is it that requires even the most lucid agent to remain unconscious of what is going on within itself? Nietzsche knows, for example, as he writes his notes on the impulses, that such impulses are acting in him, but that there is no accord between the observations he is transcribing and the impulses that have compelled him to write them. But if he is conscious of what he is writing, as the agent named Nietzsche, it is because he knows not only that he is ignorant of what has just occurred in order for him to write, but also that he must be ignorant of it, if he wants to write and think. At that very moment, he is necessarily ignorant of what he is about to call the combat of the impulses among themselves. Even if he stops writing, even if he tries to stop thinking, could we say that he is therefore abandoning himself to the unconscious in the form of an extravagant reverie? This is one aspect of the phenomenon that would lead Nietzsche to try to specify the relationship between the conscious agent and the so-called unconscious activity of the impulses in relation to this agent. For it is the agent that is unconscious of this subterranean activity. His inquiry would be undertaken in the hope of demonstrating that morality, which lies at the origin of every investigation, will be arrested only when it destroys its own foundation. Nietzsche pursues his inquiry in order to make himself finally admit that there is neither subject nor object, nor will, nor aim, nor meaning, not only at the origin, but for now and always. The notions of consciousness and unconsciousness, which are derived from what is responsible or irresponsible, always presuppose the unity of the person of the ego, of the subject, a purely institutional distinction, which is why it plays such an important role in psychiatric considerations. From the outset, this unity appears as little more than a flickering memory, maintained exclusively by the designations of the everyday code, which intervene in accordance with changing excitations, upon which they impose their own linkages, in order to conceal the total discontinuity of our state. What then is forgetfulness? It is the occultation of the signs we use to designate the groups of events that are being lived through or thought at a given moment, whether near or far. But what is it that occults this series of signs, if not the afflux of another excitation at another moment which absorbs all the available designations, while the rest of our general apparatus is put into abeyance? Either everything in us is unconscious, or everything in us is conscious. In the latter case, however, there would be a simultaneous activation of all the available signs, which would provoke a generalized insomnia. In the former case, only a minuscule portion of the signs would be active, and they would be too weak to have the slightest influence on what takes place in our depth. Our depth is governed by a completely different system of designations, for which there is neither outside nor inside. The fact remains that we are possessed, abandoned, possessed again and surprised, sometimes by the system of impulsive designations and at other times by the system of everyday signs. It is the former that confronts us, invades us, and will remain long after we disappear. Outside of it, we are little, much, nothing, depending on whether we appeal to the everyday code or not. Within it, no one knows, nor would anyone know how to know, what is being designated within us. For even when we are alone, silent, speaking internally to ourselves, it is still the outside that is speaking to us, thanks to these signs from the exterior that invade and occupy us, and whose murmuring totally covers over our impulsive life. Even our innermost recesses, even our so-called inner life, is still the residue of signs instituted from the outside under the pretext of signifying us in an objective and impartial manner. A residue that no doubt takes on the configuration of the impulsive movement characteristic of each person, and follows the contours of our ways of reacting to this invasion of signs, which we have not invented ourselves. This then is our consciousness. Where does that leave our unconscious? We cannot even look for it in our dreams, for here again, if everything on the other side of the waking state were reconstructed, this would simply be the same system of signs of the everyday code being put to a different use. It is because of the difference between this use and the use that prevails in the waking state that we can more or less recall our dreams afterwards and relate the strange words or the words of a strange banality that are offered there, through us or through other figures. Moreover, in the waking state we are capable of uttering things of the same type, whether in jest or through fatigue or through some other disturbance. When someone tells us that we are dreaming out loud, it means that something impulsive has shaken or upset the code of everyday signs. We have been surprised by our unconscious, but this is nothing. Even for someone to say this to us, the use of everyday signs is required by the interlocutor, even if it is a psychiatrist. This implies that we are totally dependent on the everyday code, even when we let ourselves be surprised by our unconscious, which, at the very least, will learn how to use the code in order to play with it and twist it around, as it pleases, even when we make fun of the psychiatrist and conceal our desire to be cured. This is why the strange behavior that would result would be, in most cases, nothing but a ruse. But a ruse of what? The ruse consists in making us believe in the coexistence of a consciousness and an unconsciousness, for if the latter survives in us, our consciousness would merely be a capacity to enter into an exchange with the exteriority of the code of everyday signs, and this capacity would amount to little more than receiving as much as possible while giving as little as possible. But we have no need to retain the greater part of this code, for the simple reason that we will never give up anything whatsoever of our own depth. The more we hold our depth in reserve for use at the proper moment, the less we penetrate into our depth, a superfluous precaution. In effect, our depth is unexchangeable because it does not signify anything. Because of this unexchangeability, we cover ourselves with the blanket we call understanding, culture, morality, all of which are based on the code of everyday signs. Beneath this cover, there would be only this nothingness, or this depth, or this chaos, or any other unnameable thing that Nietzsche might dare to utter. Why then did Nietzsche so insist on the unconscious that he sought an aim and a meaning in it, and why, on the other hand, did he reduce consciousness to nothing more than a means to this end, to this unconscious meaning? Once again, he did so in order to make use of language, the language of science and culture, to answer for what he had received, or thought he had received, as the last link in a long tradition. The suppression of the true world was also the suppression of the apparent world, and also entailed the suppression of the notions of consciousness and unconsciousness, the outside and the inside. We are only a succession of discontinuous states in relation to the code of everyday signs, and about which the fixity of language deceives us. As long as we depend on this code, we can conceive our continuity, even though we live discontinuously. But these discontinuous states merely concern the way we use, or do not use, the fixity of language. To be conscious is to make use of it. But how could we ever know what we are when we fall silent? Quote, if we wished to postulate a goal adequate to life, it could not coincide with any category of conscious life. It would rather have to explain all of them as a means to itself. The denial of life as an aim of life, an aim of evolution, existence as a great stupidity. Such a lunatic interpretation is only the product of measuring life by means of consciousness, pleasure and displeasure, good and evil. Here the means are made to stand against the end, the unholy, absurd, above all unpleasant means. How can an end that employs such means be worth anything? But the mistake is that, instead of looking for a purpose that explains the necessity of such means, we presuppose in advance a goal that actually excludes such means, i.e., we take a desideratum in respect of certain means, namely pleasant, rational, and virtuous ones, as a norm, on the basis of which we posit what general purpose would be desirable. The fundamental mistake is simply that, instead of understanding consciousness as a tool and particular aspect of the total life, we posit it as the standard and the condition of life that is of supreme value. It is the erroneous perspective of a parte ad totum, which is why all philosophers are instinctively trying to imagine a total consciousness, a consciousness involved in all life and will, in all that occurs, a spirit, God. But one has to tell them that precisely this turns life into a monstrosity, that a god and total sensorium would altogether be something on account of which life would have to be condemned, precisely that we have eliminated the total consciousness that posited ends and means is our great relief. With that, we are no longer compelled to be pessimists. Our greatest reproach against existence was the existence of God." End quote. For Nietzsche, then, there would be an end, the unconscious life, because there would be a means, which would be consciousness. This is the point we must emphasize here. Does this mean that it would be sufficient to treat consciousness as a tool that the unconscious uses in order to stop being insignificant? Or rather, was it not consciousness itself, which until Nietzsche had been posited erroneously as the supreme end, that had compelled Nietzsche toward the unconscious, and therefore bad, life, and compelled him to make absurdity the primary attribute of the authentic? This would mean institutional language, the code of everyday signs, does not allow us to designate what is authentic otherwise than as something insignificant. How then can we affirm the authenticity of life in an intelligible manner? When Nietzsche borrowed the terms means and end from language, he was paying tribute to the valorization of language. For although he knew that meaning and goal are mere fictions, as are the ego, identity, duration, and willing, it was nonetheless through these same designations that he agreed to speak in favor of an end, neither chaos nor the eternal return pursue any end other than themselves, and of the means he was putting forward, which were capable of being willed. Does this mean that Nietzsche thought of consciousness as the means to an end that would lie in the so-called unconscious life? What was the point of denouncing consciousness as an aim that had hitherto been erroneous, inasmuch as it had usurped the authentic state of existence, making us pessimistic toward it? It is a question here of a direct attack on the necessity of language, for even though language is the usurper, it never allows us to speak of our unintelligible depth except by ascribing to what is neither thought, nor said, nor willed, a meaning and an aim that we think according to language, and even if it were the inverse of a meaning or a thought-out aim, this inversion would still be, from the perspective of consciousness, a play of language. Means and end still remain within the perspective of consciousness. To use conscious categories as a means to attain an end outside consciousness is still to remain subordinate to the false perspective of consciousness. A consciousness that would be conscious of being an instrument of chaos would no longer be capable of obeying the aim of a chaos that would not even ask it to pursue such an aim. Chaos, in turn, would then be conscious and would no longer be chaos. The terms conscious and unconscious are therefore applicable to nothing that is real. If Nietzsche made use of them, it was only as a psychological convention, but he nonetheless let us hear what he did not say, namely, that the act of thinking corresponds to a passivity, and that this passivity is grounded in the fixity of the signs of language, whose combinations simulate gestures and movements that reduce language to silence. Quote, "Every movement should be conceived as a gesture, a kind of language in which impulsive forces make themselves heard. In the inorganic world, there is no misunderstanding. Communication seems to be perfect. Error begins in the organic world. Things, substances, qualities, activities. We must guard against their projection into the inorganic world. These are errors of species, through which organisms live. The problem of the possibility of error, the contradiction is not between the false and the true, but between the abbreviations of signs and the signs themselves. The essential point, the creation of forms which represent numerous movements, the invention of signs for all types of signs. All movements are signs of an inner event, and every inner movement is expressed by such modifications of forms. Thought is not yet the inner event itself, but only a semiotic corresponding to the compensation of the power of the affects. The humanization of nature, interpretation according to we others." End quote. Quote, "From each of our fundamental impulses comes a perspectival appreciation of every event and of every lived experience. Each of these impulses is hindered or favored or flattered by every other impulse, each with its own formative law, its risings and fallings, its own rhythm, etc. And one impulse dies when another one arises." End quote. Quote, "Man is a plurality of wills to power, each with a plurality of means and forms of expression. The different so-called passions, for example, man is cruel, are only fictive unities, insofar as what enters consciousness as similar from different fundamental impulses is synthetically imagined as a being, an essence, or a faculty, a passion. Just as the soul itself is an expression for all the phenomena of consciousness, but we interpret it as the cause of all these phenomena. Self-consciousness is a fiction." End quote. From this point of view, the first question we must ask concerns the function of the signs of language, or rather, in an even more rudimentary fashion, how and where are signs born? Quote, every movement should be conceived as a gesture, a kind of language in which impulsive forces make themselves heard. In the inorganic world there is no misunderstanding. Communication seems to be perfect. Error begins in the organic world. End quote. In the inorganic world, communication seems perfect. Nietzsche means there is no possible disagreement between what is strong and what is weak. Every power draws its ultimate consequence at every moment, he says elsewhere. Persuasion is immediate. In the organic world, by contrast, where exchange and assimilation are necessary, misunderstanding becomes possible, since exchange and assimilation take place only through interpretation, from trial and error to certainty, the certainty of the conditions of existence. The latter can be obtained only after a long experimentation with the similar and the dissimilar, and thus with identity. Only then can points of reference, repetition, and comparison appear, and finally, comparable signs. Now, in a universe dominated by the inorganic, organic life is itself a fortuitous case, hence a possible error in the cosmic economy. It is within this economy that interpretation, grounded in the fear of error, becomes susceptible to error. Even if the origin of organic life lies in purely random combinations, it can no longer behave randomly once it comes into existence. It must believe in its necessity, and therefore it must maintain the conditions of its existence, and to do so, it must avoid chance and not commit any errors. Hence the double aspect of error in Nietzsche. Life depends on an illusion, its necessity. Whence the verdict, quote, truth is the kind of error without which a certain species of life could not live, end quote. Let us retain this complex in Nietzsche's thought, formed by chance, error, and the interpretation of the conditions of existence, the illusion of their necessity, as well as the necessity of their illusion. If interpretation is susceptible to error, whence the possibility of misunderstanding at the highest degree of organic life, namely the human species, for which truth is an error without which it cannot live, then a code must be developed, the most evolved code of interpretation. What is this code of signs? An abbreviation of the impulsive movements of gestures in signs. No doubt, the system of interpretation that offers the largest domain of error. Nietzsche does not admit the existence of a power that would be unable to increase itself. It is this incessant augmentation that makes him say that it is not simply power, but will to power. The term Wille zur Macht, however, indicates an intention, a tendency towards, something he has already declared to be a fiction of language. A perpetual equivocity ensues, despite all his efforts to distinguish his own use of the term from the traditional concept of the will. Nietzsche finds this will to power, energy in the quantitative sense of physics, as much in the inorganic world as in the organic world, where he then assimilates it totally to what he himself calls an impulse. From the lowest level of organic life to the human species, this impulse is ramified and spiritualized, and persists both beyond and before the organs the impulses have created. The same thing occurs at the level of the human psyche, where the impulses are subject not only to a diversification, but to a total inversion by the cerebral organ, which they have worked together to form as their supreme obstacle. On one side of the obstacle represented by the cerebral function as intellect, the impulses are sometimes in league with each other, and sometimes opposed to each other in a perpetual combat. On the other side, they submit to a deforming duplication by being designated. Now Nietzsche insists on the fact that the combat of the impulses takes place through a mutual interpretation of their respective intensities, which implies their own code. The impulse reacts to excitations. This is all that remains of the impulse at the lowest level of organic life. However, chemical elements still intervene in these excitations, which in turn react on each other. An entire scale of interpretations is developed from the lowest level up to its extreme spiritualization, and in themselves, impulse and repulsion are already interpretive. Every living being interprets according to a code of signs, responding to variations in excited or excitable states, whence come images, representations of what has taken place or what could have taken place, thus a phantasm. For the impulse to become a will at the level of consciousness, the latter must give the impulse an exciting state as an aim, and thus must elaborate the signification of what, for the impulse, is a phantasm, an anticipated excitation, and thus a possible excitation according to the schema determined by previously experienced excitations. The attraction of the phantasm is produced from the relation between impulsive forces of varying intensity, which makes a discharge necessary. At the level of consciousness, this relation of forces is subject to modification by contrary impulses, impulsive traces that are equivalent to signs. Thus, conscious or unconscious states exist only when already existing signifying traces are or are not re-excited by a more or less variable afflux, this afflux itself being modified in the sense that other traces are then eliminated. The signs of language are entirely dependent on this excitation and are produced whenever they coincide with re-excitable traces. A phantasm, or several phantasms, can be formed in accordance with the relations among impulsive forces, some of which will be codified when these forces intensify this or that signifying trace. In this manner, something new and unfamiliar is misinterpreted as something already known, just as traces that have never been intensified previously suddenly are intensified. An old and uncodified circumstance appears as new. Quote, "The contradiction is not between the true and the false, but between abbreviations of signs and the signs themselves." End quote. What this means is that the impulses, which confront and interpret each other through their fluctuations of intensity and, at the level of organized beings, through gestures, create forms out of these movements and gestures, and cannot be distinguished from this invention of signs, which stabilizes them through abbreviation. For in abbreviating them, these signs reproduce the impulses, apparently suspending their fluctuation once and for all. But in the intervals of the fixed signs of language, the intensity of the impulses can only be designated in an intermittent and arbitrary manner in comparison with these abbreviations. Their movement is constituted as a meaning only if they take this designating abbreviation as their aim and reach it through a combination of unities. The latter then form a declaration which sanctions the fall of the intensity once and for all. For consciousness, these abbreviations of signs, words, are in effect the sole vestiges of its continuity. That is to say, they are invented in a sphere where the true and the false necessitate the erroneous representation that something can endure or remain identical, that something can endure or remain identical, and thus that there can be an agreement between the invented signs and what they are supposed to designate. Moreover, this is why the impulses themselves must now signify a coherent unity, and their similarity or dissimilarity can be assessed only in relation to a primary unity. This unity will henceforth be the soul of the agent, or its conscience, or its intellect. In the final analysis, they are qualified as passions, insofar as they become an object of the agent's judgment, who considers them only insofar as they affect its unity or cohesion in the absence of such a judgment. They become the passions, or affections, of the subject, and just as the impulses are ignorant of the agent, so the agent interprets the impulses as its own propensities, tendencies, or inclinations, terms that always concern the representation of an enduring unity, a fixity, a summit that necessarily has slopes. From this point of view, Nietzsche retains the word affect to indicate their autonomy in relation to the forces which, while subordinate to the fallacious unity of the agent, constantly modify it, making it mobile and fragile. Itself a product of this abbreviation of signs, the agent nonetheless thinks itself to be beyond the signs proper, which are impulsive movements, and hence movements, according to Nietzsche, that function as interpretable gestures, including those executed by the agent, whether it speaks or remains silent. But already, these gesticulations are no longer expressing the movements that were signifying each other mutually beneath the agent. If they feel the effects of each other's constraint and gesticulate as a consequence, the system of signs abbreviates the gestures of the impulsive constraint and lead it back to the coherent unity of the agent, which forms the grammatical subject in a series of propositions and declarations about everything that happens to it, whether from without or from within. Consequently, the impulse or repulsion, resistance or non-resistance, which originally served as a model for this abbreviating system, is now rendered insignificant by the agent. The intensities, impulse, repulsion, take on a signification only if they are first reduced by the abbreviating system to the intentional states of the agent. The agent now thinks or believes it is thinking, depending on whether it feels its persistence to be threatened or assured, and notably the persistence of its intellect. The intellect is nothing more than a repulsion of anything that might destroy the cohesion between the agent and this abbreviating system, as when the adventure of the agent gives way to fluctuations of intensity devoid of any intention. Or, on the contrary, it is a pure and simple impulse, insofar as it abbreviates these fluctuations in the form of thought. Now, how is thought itself possible, if not because the fluctuations of intensity are ceaselessly opposed to their own abbreviation? Nietzsche says that we have no language to express what is in becoming. Thought is always the result of a momentary relation of power between impulses, principally between those that dominate and those that resist. The fact that one thought succeeds another thought, the second apparently engendered by the first, is the sign, says Nietzsche, of how the situation of power among the impulses is modified in the interval. And he adds, the will, a fallacious reification, by which he means that all willing that starts with consciousness is still merely a fiction, due to this abbreviation of signs by the signs themselves. Now it is a condition of existence for the agent to be ignorant of the combat from which its thought is derived. It is not this living unity of the subject, but the combat of the impulses that wills to maintain itself. The combat that wills to maintain itself. This was the unintelligible and authentic depth out of which Nietzsche wanted to establish a new cohesion beyond the agent between the body and chaos, a state of tension between the fortuitous cohesion of the agent and the incoherence of chaos. At the outset, a machinery appeared, which Nietzsche enjoyed studying but not without malice. Moreover, it was the forces themselves that implied a machinery, since they seemed to reduce the human being to the status of an automaton. Whence the liberatory sentiment. One can reconstruct the living being in conformity with these same forces, thereby restoring an impulsive spontaneity to it. First, one must admit everything that is purely automatic. To dismantle an automaton is not to reconstruct a subject. Since perspectivism is the characteristic illusion of this automaton, to provide it with the knowledge of this illusory perspective, the consciousness of this unconscious, is to create the conditions of a new freedom, a creative freedom. The consciousness of the unconscious can consist only in a simulation of forces. It is not a matter of destroying what Nietzsche calls the abbreviation of signs by signs themselves, the encoding of movements, but of retranslating the conscious semiotic into the semiotic of the impulses. The conscious categories that avoid, repudiate, and betray these movements, and thus remain ignorant of the perpetual combat of forces, sustain the automatism under the apparent spontaneity of thought. To recover an authentic spontaneity, the producer of these categories, the intellectual organ, must in turn be treated as a simple automaton, a pure tool. By consequence, as a spectator of itself, the automaton finds its freedom only in the spectacle that moves from intensity to intention, and from the latter to intensity. Quote, "From time immemorial, we have ascribed the value of an action, a character, an existence, to the intention, the purpose for the sake of which one has acted or lived. This age-old idiosyncrasy finally takes a dangerous turn, provided, that is, that the absence of intention and purpose in events comes more and more to the forefront of consciousness. Thus there seems to be in preparation a universal devaluation. Nothing has any meaning. This melancholy sentence means all meaning lies in intention, and if intention is altogether lacking, then meaning is altogether lacking too. In accordance with this valuation, one was constrained to transfer the value of life to a life after death, or to the progressive development of ideas, or of mankind, or of the people, or beyond mankind. But with that one had arrived at a progressus in infinitum of purposes. One was at last constrained to make a place for oneself in the world process, perhaps with the disdaemonistic perspective that it was a process into nothingness. In this regard, purpose requires a more vigorous critique. One must understand that an action is never caused by a purpose, that purpose and means are interpretations whereby certain points in an event are emphasized and selected at the expense of other points, which indeed form the majority. That every single time something is done with a purpose in view, something fundamentally different and other occurs. That every purposive action is like the supposed purposiveness of the heat the sun gives off. The enormously greater part is squandered. A part hardly worth considering serves a purpose, has meaning. That a purpose and its means provide an indescribably imprecise description, which can indeed issue commands as a prescription, as a will, but which presupposes a system of obedient and trained tools, which in place of indefinite entities posit nothing but fixed magnitudes, i.e., we imagine a system of shrewder but narrower intellects that posit purposes and means in order to be able to ascribe to our only known purpose the role of the cause of an action, to which procedure we really have no right. It would mean solving a problem by placing the solution in a world inaccessible to our observation. Finally, why could a purpose not be an epiphenomenon in the series of changes in the activating forces that bring about the purposive action, a pale image sketched in consciousness beforehand that serves to orient us concerning events, even as a symptom of events, not as their cause? But with this we have criticized the will itself. Is it not an illusion to take for a cause that which rises to consciousness as an act of will? Are not all phenomena of consciousness merely terminal phenomena, final links in a chain, but apparently conditioning one another in their succession on one level of consciousness? This could be an illusion." End quote. Thus, there is no intention apart from the code of signs established by consciousness, insofar as the intention aspires to an end which is assigned to the will by consciousness. An aim is merely an image provoked by active forces which are experienced and codified as an intention. Between the level of consciousness and that of active forces, there is what we call a fit of ill humor, by which we mean something suffered at the hands of active forces and which cannot be envisioned at the conscious level except afterwards. At the end of such a physiological inquiry, there would remain no authority that human behavior could appeal to, if not, on the one hand, the exteriority of institutional language, with all the consequences this entails for the individual, and on the other hand, an uncontrollable interiority, whose unpredictability has no limits other than those implied by institutional language. The exteriority that language represents within the one who uses it, through which the individual tries to make itself understood, forces the individual to maintain these entities, destroyed by Nietzsche, and to make its own gestures and reflections conform to these entities. What would happen to human behavior if it were grounded in a certain degree of lucidity, that is, once again in the physiological consciousness of oneself and others? If at every moment individuals understood each other by the fact that they were not willing this when they were nonetheless designating it, if in return they always experienced a that which each person would always have to infer in the other, which would be laughable from the point of view of good sense. Indeed, it is obvious that in varying degrees, if not this consciousness, then at least the veiled apprehension of a similar distrust, whether conventional or not, has always existed and arisen suddenly within good sense itself. Now, Nietzsche clearly foresaw that such a lucidity, the new consciousness of the more or less subtle conditioning that underlies every mode of behaving, thinking, feeling, and willing, if it ever managed to prevail, would institute such a new conformity that he finally turned away from it in derision. This, however, is the content of his invention of the eternal return. For if such a lucidity is impossible, what the doctrine of the vicious circle tends to demonstrate is that belief in the return, adherence to the nonsense of life, in itself implies an otherwise impracticable lucidity. We cannot renounce language, nor our intentions, nor our willing, but we could evaluate this willing and these intentions in a different manner than we have hitherto evaluated them, namely, as subject to the law of the vicious circle. Moreover, the doctrine of the vicious circle, which is a sign of forgetfulness, is grounded in the forgetfulness of what we have been and will be, not only for innumerable times, but for all time and always. We are other than we are now, others that are not elsewhere, but always in this same life. Now for Nietzsche is not lucidity, which means the thought of a total discordance between the hidden reality and the one that is claimed or admitted, the opposite of life. Is it not the inertia of power? Is it not precisely the non-true, the error that permits the human species to survive? does not the unconsciousness of this physiological conditioning correspond to certain indispensable conditions of existence for this animal species? Is this not what Nietzsche has been ceaselessly affirming? However, had he not stated with equal force that the only way we can overcome our servitude is by knowing that we are not free? That as pure mechanisms, pure automatons, we gain in spontaneity by knowing this? On the one hand, forgetfulness and unconsciousness are necessary to life. On the other hand, there is a will to unconsciousness, which, precisely because it is willed, implies the consciousness of our conditioned state, an irresoluble antinomy. Now, quote, life itself created this grave thought of the eternal return. Life wants to overcome its supreme obstacle, end quote.